Hey guys, it's Ken. Welcome to the new video, and today I thought I'd talk about Quiet on Set, the dark side of kids TV, a new docu-series that came out on Max through the ID channel. Everybody on social media seems to be exploding over this stuff that has been pretty much out there for a long time. A few things have been dug up since this aired that weren't public knowledge. So the first episode starts off really doing a brilliant job of putting you back in that time. I remember being a kid during that era and growing up with a lot of these shows. Does a great job of putting you back in that simplistic era where it was before the internet and unlimited streaming services, where we just had everything in our phones. And basically when you were a kid, you had Disney or Nick, and those were your options growing up, and hopefully you had cable.
God, it sounds so old saying, you know, before when I was coming up, there was no internet. Like, but there wasn't.
We didn't have Netflix and Hulu. We didn't have 10 things to choose from.
So it's interesting and chilling being a person who grew up with that stuff to look back on it now through the lens of this doc, and it sets that whole era up perfectly. And then we go into the internet, discovering certain clips and viewing them with a different context, and how a lot of them have not aged well, and how could you not view it as something oddly sexual for this group of specific weirdos. And then we go into Nick in general and the kind of beginnings and a little bit of Double Dare. We get Mark Summers showing up. Poor Mark Summers having to watch that Ariana Grande clip. It literally broke my heart watching that moment.
Did that air on Nickelodeon?
And then we go into Dan's beginnings, where he started out like as an actor and then created Head of the Class and got in there, and then that eventually led to him being invited on to Nick to write all that, I think. The show grows in popularity, certain members are swapped out, and he ends up finding Amanda Bynes and bringing her into all that cast. That, of course, leads into The Amanda Show, which is the roughest stuff of the first episode. Was a lot of the stuff with the female writers. One particular moment stuck out to me where it's like, I'm surprised more people aren't talking about that.
Do you remember Dan asking you to act out being...
I'd rather not. I'd rather not. I don't want to talk about that.
But we start to see the seeds of like how much of a dick Dan Schneider was behind the scenes as his kind of power began to grow. And then in episode 2, Amanda's star is rising. She's getting older. She wants to start taking on more adult roles. This leads to What I Like About You, the series I vaguely remember seeing a few episodes of back in the day. And I guess Dan saw this opportunity to kind of grow with Amanda and get out of children's television and take that next step into his career. Didn't really work out that way. This leads to him returning to all that with an all-new cast. And this was the era I was very familiar with growing up. So on the one hand, there was that excitement of like, wow, I haven't seen Kyle Sullivan. I was always wondering like what happened to the dude, and you know, Giovanni Samuels, like where have these people been? Like, you know, it's that initial like, whoa, I can't believe, you know, and then they get into their stories and it gets really like, oh, okay.
The show is full of like these uncomfortable sketches. I think that Dan got a kick out of walking a line with that.
And then Brian Hearns is a cast member who talks about dealing with racial issues, Dan not relating to him the same way he would relate to the other white cast members. I always remember as a kid, he always felt kind of sidelined as a cast member, and he would only get to do specific kind of gags. So it was interesting to hear his perspective as far as that, and it gave me some answers as to what might have happened there and why he didn't end up continuing further on the show. Then they talk about on-air dares, which was something I never caught growing up. I think I caught the Family Channel reruns, and those were like separate segments, I think maybe during commercial breaks, I'm not too sure. But Brian going into that whole section was pretty fucking crazy, a lot of the shit that they had to go through.
The thing that was most uncomfortable is having to watch your fellow castmates be essentially tortured. If there's anything on set that I wish I could have yelled, stop, let's not do this, I'm out, it's still on their dares.
And then we're starting to see more of Dan's kind of hunger for power grow, and he's starting to treat employees and cast members differently, and being more short and harsh, and talking through employees to other employees, like really fucking crazy shit. It's also in this episode they touch on Jason Handy, who was the first pedophile exposed as working at Nickelodeon, and he was a production assistant on this whole era of all that, and The Amanda Show, and a bunch of other stuff. We then jump into Brian Peck, which anybody who's been following a lot of these kind of docs and stories is very familiar with at this point. Looking back, it's interesting because I grew up with that era of all that. I remember the character Pickle Boy. I just never made the correlation that that was the same dude. My first memory of knowing who Brian Peck was by name was seeing him in the Return of the Living Dead documentary. And at the time I was like, shit, this guy seems cool as hell. He's like really knowledgeable about old movies and monster stuff and horror. And like, this guy seems like the coolest dude to hang out with. You know, it makes a lot of sense. Like this is how those guys operate. They operate off of charm and charisma. So it's like, oh, that makes a lot of scary sense, actually. It also touches on Brian's arrest involving a Nickelodeon actor and how the court records at the time were sealed and have been sealed for the past 20 years or so, and nobody knew the identity of the actor involved.
It wasn't dealing with anybody on the shows or anything, right?
It was a child actor.
On one of our shows.
Yes.
And it's now been revealed, I think before the docu-series even came out, so it's not much of a spoiler, is that it was Drake Bell. So the third episode is when we go into Drake's story full on, and aside from being heartbreaking from the abuse angle, it's a really interesting look at his career and how he came up as a young actor. I remember seeing him in Home Improvement and Seinfeld growing up, but I didn't know about Jerry Maguire and some other things, so it was an interesting kind of mini doc on his career in general. But there's no way around it. You get to the later, harder stuff in that episode, and it's heartbreaking. It's hard to listen to, a lot of it. It takes a lot for somebody to come forward with that kind of information, and so yeah, good on him for coming forward and, you know, sharing his story the way he did.
I really don't know how to elaborate on that on camera, really.
Whatever you feel comfortable or you think will help.
Why don't you do this?
Yeah.
Why don't you think of the worst stuff that someone can do to somebody as a and that'll answer your question.
Aside from the details of the abuse and the grooming and stuff like that, there were a few light moments that I enjoyed, like when Drake's reminiscing different characters that he did on The Amanda Show. It seems to take him 2 seconds to get back into doing Totally Kyle, which was just like, holy shit, man. But yeah, not going into too much detail about that episode, it's a long, grueling grooming process of Brian slowly kind of weeding his dad out and putting a wedge in their relationship, getting close with Drake's mom and kind of putting ideas in her head and shit. And it's, of all the kind of Hollywood pedophilia exposés that have come out over the last like 10-15 years, it's probably the most black and white, where you can see kind of how these guys work as far as the grooming process and how they maintain their hold and really wedge themselves into the families, into their lifestyles. It's diabolical, heartbreaking stuff. Drake eventually breaks, and then Brian's arrested, and then we get to the last episode, and this is where the trial begins, and Drake shows up to the courtroom, and there's a full, you know, Brian's side is completely full with all kinds of different recognizable names. There was 40-something letters from different celebrities, you know, showing their support. People like Will Friedle, Alan Thicke, Ryder Strong, James Marsden. And then it's during the same time we get another pedophile outed at Nickelodeon, Azeel Channel. I might be butchering that name, but who gives a shit? And it's kind of brushed under the rug because this is now Dan's kind of new era of shows where he's working on, you know, Drake and Josh and iCarly, Victorious, like he seems to be on his second wave. And it's also here where Dan really starts to take his knowledge of the internet and how to market the different shows to new heights, where he sets up Dan Warp and starts doing the little videos where he's more or less just scaring the shit out of or intimidating cast members for no reason.
You can see palpable discomfort on people's faces.
I'm trying to scare Jeanette.
There's one video in particular where Dan creeps behind Jeanette. It scares her.
Oh my gosh, that scared me so.
But she can't say, I didn't like that, or she can't not have a sense of humor about it, and she can't not play with it because she has to.
And I'll admit, this was the era of Dan stuff. I was kind of checked out. I was watching different stuff at that point. So I wasn't really into iCarly or Salmon Cat or any of that shit. I think Zoe 101 was probably the last one I watched, you know, as it aired. And then we're cutting back to the kind of internet resurgence and interest into all these different skits and innuendo jokes and what does this all mean and why was this in a kid's show, and how that coincides with the Me Too movement and people rightfully calling out scumbags in Hollywood for their inappropriate behavior or harassment. And then Nickelodeon and Dan quietly just part ways, and you know, he just goes off into the ether, but you're just left on that kind of cold note at the end where you're like, okay, well, can the industry get any better for kids? Is there going to be kind of rules put in place so that these people can't work with kids again? Unlike Brian Peck, who still got jobs on Sweet Life of Zack and Cody and other Disney shit after his initial arrest. So it's like, what kind of safety nets do children have within this industry? Is there anything that can be done about it, really? And that's the kind of depressing note that the docuseries ends on. And then interestingly, a couple of days ago, Dan would post a response interview, if that's what you want to call it, where he gets some extra from iCarly to interview him, and it's framed that Dan was asked to join them for some reason, even though it's from his YouTube channel.
Every one of those jokes was written for a kid audience because kids thought they were funny and only funny, okay? Now we have some adults looking back at them 20 years later through their lens, and they're looking at them and they're saying, oh, you know, I don't think that's appropriate for a kid show.
It's interesting because I had a friend make a comment about it's really interesting how now, you know, that it took this docu-series, you know, for people to really take this shit seriously when most of us have known about a lot of this stuff for years. And I think that's part of the sad truth. It needed some sort of a mainstream, I guess glossy, for lack of a better term, kind of presentation of this material to get it out to the masses like this. I'm thinking about the past attempts to tell the same story or get the same message out there to people, like An Open Secret or even Felt Dog's Doc. Both of them had really messy releases and were kind of pushed away and shrouded in secrecy and bullshit claims and all this other stuff. So they never really got out to the masses in a way that it needed to get this story kind of more known and more out there. So as heartbreaking as a lot of the stuff is, I think it is really important to get these stories out there so that these monsters can hopefully pay for what they did, and the cycle of abuse can be cut off for once and not continue for generations to come. So yeah, pretty heavy stuff, but insanely well made. The archival footage, the editing, the interviews, insanely well done and well put together. But I think it is important. It's stuff that should be out there, and I commend all the cast members and former talent and production assistants and all the different people who came forward to tell their stories, because again, it takes a lot to come forward with that kind of stuff, and it lends some hope to the future of a lot of these kids. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you guys dug this one, let me know down below. I'm just about finished the next horror review, which is going to be for 1979's The Demon. Keep your eyes peeled for that one very, very soon. Episode 2 of Two Corys Forever is out on Staunch TV. Go check that out. Spotify version coming soon. Until next time, guys, have a good one. #kids2.